In this video, we'll be taking a look at Motif 1.2 for Linux. Motif was a UI toolkit that was the de facto standard for Unix applications during the 90s. Its widespread adoption on proper Unix workstations also made it desired on Linux, as Linux can already run a lot of Unix software. Unlike most things on Linux, however, this UI toolkit was proprietary and commercial, requiring users to pay a $150 license fee to use it. But how did we even get here? As you might know, Unix isn't one coherent operating system. The two main flavors of Unix, System 5 and BSD, form the basis of a number of Unix operating systems. Almost every Unix workstation manufacturer had their own version. Within the Unix ecosystem, there were a number of standards for interoperability, like POSIX, aimed to make applications portable between different versions of Unix. This started at the command line utilities and the core operating system APIs, and would later include graphics with X11. Basically all versions of Unix at this point, except for NextStep, would end up using X11 as its foundation for graphical user interfaces. One of the problems X11 had, however, was that it didn't have a solid API for writing your applications. It was all very low level, and you didn't get much help in terms of widgets and other constructs. There was a number of efforts to rectify this with widget libraries riding on top of X11 and the X Toolkit, like the Athena widgets by MIT and XView by Sun. Both of these were open source and available on Linux, but the Athena widgets wasn't as good, and XView wasn't as widely supported on commercial Unix. In an effort to standardize this, the Open Software Foundation ran a request for technology from various parties and vendors in the Unix space to suggest existing technologies to form the future standard UI toolkit. Of a dozen submitted proposals, Dex XUI was selected for the widget library. As it was based on a proprietary technology, the Motif implementation had to be licensed to be included with Unix. As most Unix versions cost thousands of dollars per license, this wasn't a huge cost to absorb for such a fundamental component. That way, users didn't have to go out and separately license the technology. By 93, it had become a standard component of pretty much every relevant Unix system, and it even became an IEEE standard. As it quickly became the standard UI toolkit to use, a lot of Unix software was written using it. When Linux came around, there wasn't really any OS license fee, and thus no vendor that would hide this cost. As a result, a vendor called Metrolink would port Motif to Linux in 93. The licensing model changed a bit after the announcement, and would later stabilize at $150 per license. This would include development libraries, headers, and both dynamic and static link libraries, as well as development documentation and example programs. As it had to be licensed per user, you couldn't even run dynamically linked Motif programs without paying for a license, as the libraries weren't freely distributable. While there were a few scares about statically linked programs using Motif not being freely distributable, it was common practice for open source applications using Motif to have statically linked binaries distributed, occasionally with a dynamically linked version made available for those who had the libraries. So, with that background out of the way, it's time to have a look at a copy of Motif for Linux. Except, this is where I hit a snag. There are no such distributions archived as far as I can tell. I haven't even been able to find a photo of the disks. When I started working on this video 2 years ago, there was literally nothing. But some source code has since been released and archived, and a few binary releases from 95 and later have appeared. But the fact remains, the only binary release I was able to find from 94 and earlier was the one included on Yggdrasil's fall 1994 disk, which is Motif 1.2.3. It required a separate license fee to be paid to use it, and for every license sold, Yggdrasil would donate $5 towards the development of an open source alternative. To make it more difficult to pirate this copy of Motif, they encrypted it. The encrypted copy, along with the decryption utility, is on the disk. You'd open the utility and get a randomly generated installation license ID, which would change every time you opened the utility. Then you would send this installation ID, along with a proof of purchase or something, to Yggdrasil, and they would send back a matching unlock key. This would allow your copy of Motif to be decrypted and thus installed. Sadly, Yggdrasil computing ceased existing more than 20 years ago, so if I want to decrypt this thing, I'll have to do it myself.
A friend helped me decompile the unlock utility, and with a modern computer, brute forcing the keys only took a few days. Back then, this would have been quite a challenge though, probably impossible.
In this distribution, You can find the libraries, both dynamic and static link versions, as well as headers, resource files, and a number of examples, both in source code and compiled binary form, as well as several hundred kilobytes of bug reports. We also get the Motif Window Manger. Now, my computer is a bit anemic for Motif development, with 8 megs of RAM being listed as minimum and 12 megs of RAM being recommended, but I'm sure it'll be fine. 8 megs of RAM is the minimum recommended for X11 in general anyway, so... I'm currently running Debian 0.91 on my computer, by the way, in case you didn't see my last few videos. I'm going to start out by checking out the Motif Window Manager. It comes with a few sample configurations, so I put the more complete of them in my home directory in ReloadX Windows. Spoiler alert, I wasn't able to get the configuration files to do anything. It always ended up with the built-in defaults for everything. The Motif Window Manager itself doesn't feel like anything special, but it does work quite well. It has some of the comforts from Windows 3, like the window menu in the top left, double-clicking that closes the window. Maximize works just like on Windows, and Minimize does a similar thing where the window is iconized on your desktop. You're supposed to be able to close Windows with Alt F4 and use Alt Tab, but it doesn't seem to work without the config file. The Motif Window Manager would later be included with the common desktop environment on commercial Unix systems. Final standardization on CDE was just around the corner in late '94. Motif did gain traction even on Linux, and quite a few applications were made available using it, like this CD player made specifically for the kind of single-speed Mitsumi CD-ROM drive that I have, to text editors like this one, to this sky map thing that helps amateur astronomers find planets in the sky and such, and this program which I think is for planning light flying routes, not to mention stuff like browsers. Both Mosaic and Netscape used Motif, and was available on Linux from the start pretty much, even before the Windows ports. A small number of commercial applications, like WordPerfect, could with some hand-holding run on Linux. The Unixware version did apparently run on Linux using the IBCS2 compatibility kernel module, but I didn't have enough disk space to try it. The Motif distribution also comes with a number of examples to study, from a simple hello world, to this piano thing which somehow uses the PC speaker, to this air travel booking mockup, which I think tries to demonstrate the use of multiple dialogues and such, and this periodic table of widgets, which tries to show all the widgets and dialogues available in Motif. Here we can also see some of the quirks of Motif that we don't see in many other toolkits, like being able to copy or move text between text boxes by dragging. I think GTK is the only modern toolkit that can do this. And these pop-up menus, see the perforated line? If we tear along it, it'll pop off into its own window. I'm sure that's useful. But enough playing with the environment and the samples. Let's have a look at what Motif actually is. It's a fairly advanced widget toolkit, and there's really two parts to it. There's a complicated API for dealing with creating, registering, using, and handling widgets. Motif itself ships with a number of canned widgets and dialogues, like we saw earlier. Widgets are the actual buttons, menus, text fields, scroll bars, and all those other graphical things you actually interact with. All of this is done through a C API, which will look a little familiar if you use GTK with C. Not a surprise, GTK was developed as a replacement for Motif, and software like the GIMP was originally built with Motif. The other part to it is the UIL, or User Interface Language. This allows widgets, objects, dialogues, and other resources to be described in a text file, which is then managed by the Motif Resource Manager to help connect the UIL descriptions to the application code. The UIL bit is optional, but it can help reduce the amount of boilerplate code that tends to come with GUI programming. Unlike some modern toolkits, its API is not completely self-contained in the sense that it does not wrap its lower layers. Motif is primarily a widget toolkit, so it doesn't, for example, wrap xlib functionality for creating windows. Motif itself is built on Xtoolkit, like Athena and XView, and makes heavy use of its constructs. If you have programmed with GTK before, the Xtoolkit can does the same thing as G-Object, providing an object-oriented framework to build widgets with, providing a framework for stuff like callbacks, events, and inheritance. But it doesn't provide any widgets itself. To get a feel for the toolkit, I decided to make a simple application. Specifically, I decided to make a GUI for the code generator I made while figuring out the encryption for this Motif distribution. I decided to use UIL to define the user interface, as most of the examples used it. I based it on the Hello Motif and Motif Anim demo applications. I start by defining a window. Just an empty window to load to make sure that this bit works. Then I mostly just copy the C code from the other examples, which should load the URL and instantiate the window. Since I'm using URL, I also use MRM, or the Motif Resource Manager. And pretty much all the code here is to initialize MRM, the X Toolkit, and load a definition file, and then instantiate the window. This last register name call is to map function pointers to the functions that are listed in the URL file. This is what MRM map callbacks in the URL file to actual code, as the linker itself isn't involved in this. And then I just need to let MRM load a window, and then I can hand it off to the X Toolkit to manage it. This whole widget type is defined by X Toolkit, and Motif then extends it with the widget implementations. Then I just need to fix all my mistakes, and I should be able to get it building. And with it building, I just need to figure out which libraries I need to make it link. But sadly it doesn't work. It took me a bit of head scratching, but after looking closer at the sample projects, apparently you need to compile the URL file too. So I did that, and now I get an empty window like I should. With a working basis, I can start adding widgets to the window. Here's also a good opportunity to point out the difference between defining a UI in URL versus a Windows resource file. I'm not hard coding the position and size of the widgets in terms of pixels. Instead, I'm just setting up positions in relation to other widgets. I could poke pixel values directly too though if I wanted to. Along with the widgets, I'm also mapping a callback function that will get called when a button is pressed. It does however seem like I messed up the relation regarding how widgets are positioned relative to each other. After messing around with it a bit, I got that sorted out. Now all I have to do is write a bit of code that will run when a button is pressed, to grab the install ID and generate the unlock key. So I write some code to fetch that text field and write it to the terminal, and it doesn't read anything? This had me scratching my head for a while. What I didn't realize is that MRM fetch widget doesn't give you the existing widget in a window, it instantiates a new one. So I was trying to read the text from an invisible copy of the widget. I eventually gave up and started looking at a programming manual. There I found an example that sets up a widget create callback and records the widget ID there. I still didn't know I was trying to read back from a copy at this point, so I started by connecting a callback to the input change event. When I then tried to read the string in that callback with the widget ID I was provided, and it worked, it finally clicked. So I set up the creation callback and now I have it working. So I could hook up the key generator bit and I had a working program. In general, this all felt pretty powerful. I can imagine that this works quite well for larger applications. So now I just want to make a build of this and try to unlock Motif on Yggdrasil with it. This means linking statically with Motif, as the system where you want to use it doesn't have Motif installed yet. And this highlights another downside with these libraries, and that you can't redistribute them freely. Despite being such a simple program, the resulting binary is a whole megabyte, and the only thing I'm linking statically is Motif. This was the case with pretty much every open source application using Motif. You had these huge binaries.
Motif would retain its position as the best UI toolkit on Linux until the late 90s, when alternatives like GTK and Qt became available. By that time, the open source Motif implementation Lestic was also starting to mature. Relying on a proprietary library for a free software project was quite contentious back then, but there weren't really any good alternatives. This is also why Qt, which initially launched with a GPL incompatible license, was so polarizing in the free software movement. Everyone knew of the pain that Motif caused, so was the cure really another proprietary toolkit? This is all a story for another time though. After developing with Motif for a few days, I can conclude that the 8MB minimum RAM recommendation checks out. My computer only has 5MB, and there was a lot of sitting around while the disk was crunching away. GCC in itself is a bit of a pain to run under X Windows with so little RAM, but even launching a small application takes a while. Motif is quite a spaceship in complexity and code size, so it doesn't really scale down all that well. This is also one of the disadvantages with the proprietary nature of it. Most users of Motif programs on Linux will be running a statically linked version. This means that every application needs to bring its own copy of the Motif library, which also needs to be loaded into RAM for each and every application. At a time when the GUI toolkit made up a significant chunk of the loaded code on a computer, this was far from ideal. It completely forgoes the advantages of using shared libraries, that would allow multiple programs to share one copy of the library in RAM, not to mention all the wasted disk space. With today's use of Electron apps and Chrome Embedded Framework, I guess we've come full circle.
Anyway, I boot into Yggdrasil and I try to install Motif, and I get this error message. So I try launching the installer manually, and then I run my generate application, generate a key, and I really hope they wouldn't try to read this out to you over the phone. And it's accepted. It doesn't install Motif successfully, but I can see real file names flying past, so it was successful in unlocking it at least. So, here's my question for you. Did you pay for Yggdrasil's Motif back in the day? Did you get it working without special handling, or is the installer just busted? Let me know in the comments. Anyway, this concludes the 94 season. It's gonna be a while until the 95 season is out, so feel free to subscribe to the channel to be notified when it's out. Until then, thank you for watching.